All right, well, the lights have gone down, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Zube Lecture Series, and welcome to the Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning. Please, if you haven't already, get some snacks. Snacks are in the back, snacks and drinks. Make yourselves comfortable. We have a wonderful talk in store for you today. My name is Peter Dunn. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning. I'm also the faculty coordinator for the Zube Lecture Series. The Zube Lecture Series, as many of you know, is a gift of the former head of our department, Irv Zube, and his wife, Margaret Zube, who created this fund and this endowment so that we could, I have this quote because I like it, can bring scholars to the department to stimulate and enrich our academic community in landscape architecture and planning. So we are all benefiting from that today. We have a number of exciting speakers coming up for the entire semester. Next week, just so you know, is Annalise Bischoff, who is giving a talk entitled A Look at the Women and the Etchings of Frank A. Law. So come back for that. But today, we're very excited to have Adrienne Keane, who will be introduced by our own Professor Elizabeth Enfield. Last week we had one of those. Thank you, Elizabeth Enfield.
My pleasure. Thank you, Peter. For a little while, there were actually 3 Elizabeths on faculty in the department. That was a mess. I'm so happy today to be welcoming Dr. Adrienne Keane, who is with us from the University of Sydney. She is on her sabbatical and is traveling around talking with different departments about the ways they are teaching and educating students to think about uncertainty, which I think is just fascinating. Right, because really there is a lot of uncertainty and we're not that good at managing it. So I think thinking about how we can do that and how we can train that better is really important. So it's an exciting research project. But I've known Professor Keane for a number of years, initially through, we were talking today, trying to remember when we first met. There's this group called the International Urban Planning and Environment that runs conferences periodically, and we work together on that. And then we've been connected through this international group looking at climate change education. So you notice sort of a through thread there for her, which is a real focus on education and how we train students and how we train planners, in part because she has a background as a practicing planner, which has, I think, informed her research and teaching quite a bit. I asked her how she would like to be introduced, and practicing planner is one of the key things that came forward. If you know people from Australia, they flaunting credentials is not considered important, polite in Sydney, but nevertheless she is a very highly credentialed person with her PhD from the University of Sydney. Worked with a colleague of mine, Nicole Gurin, there, and has really been doing some terrific work since. I'm very excited about this talk as we get to learn a little more about how planning is done outside the context of the United States. So a warm welcome, please, for Adrienne Keane.
Thank you for such a warm welcome and that round of applause. That was really super. I'm thrilled actually to be here at UMass in Amherst. This is the first time I've been to this university. I've been saying to just nearly everyone that I'm loving this building because the one I've got at Sydney is a lovely brutalist building and we don't all fit in. So it's really nice to be in a place that's so light and modern. It's just gorgeous. So I'm going to talk about koalas today and I'll explain why in a little while. But I think the captivating word might be in the title stupid, because that's how sometimes I feel planning can be when we're trying to deal with very important and complex issues. But I'll see if I can unpack that shortly. As you guys do hear about acknowledgement of country, I'd like to do the same. But I also want to share that we at the University of Sydney, we take the opportunity to acknowledge the Gadi people because that's where our main campus is on, the land of the Gadi people as part of the Eora Nation. And some of you who were in the climate change lecture the other day with me might remember that I said one of the things that we say is we acknowledge ancestors past, present and emerging. And I'm particularly fond of the emerging bit because you think, how do you have an emerging ancestor? But when you think about it, it's actually about the younger people learning who will be the leaders in the future. And I think that's pretty fantastic. So I thought I'd put a map up just in case people don't know where Australia is. And I'll say it again, it's not Austria in Europe. It's actually down there in the South Pacific. And it's a pretty big continent, and I've just overlaid it over the US to give you a bit of an idea. We are absolutely a huge place. 85% of people live within 50 kilometres of the coast, so we're very water focused. And as you can see, if you look around the edges, most of it except maybe for the Midwest there, Western Australia on your left, it really has a lot of forests, very green, fertile land. But we are actually the driest inhabited continent in the world with 10 deserts, which I only learned about that the other day when I looked it up, 10 deserts. That sounds pretty fantastic. In our latest, a bit more about our history, I guess, is that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have actually been, there's heaps of chairs, guys, come in and take a seat. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures have been continuously in Australia for over 60,000 years, and that makes them actually the longest continuing culture across the planet. And albeit too late, I think we're starting to learn more from the First Nations people of our continent about how to care for country as how they refer to it. They have such a better understanding of our landscapes and ecosystems than anyone that's moved in so far, which is not too late, I guess. In our latest, or the last State of Environment report for the whole country, it's identified that we've got about 600 to 700,000 native species, which is pretty good. Many of them are quite unique, and the scientists reckon there's about another 400,000 that haven't been discovered. I love that they can put a number on how many we haven't discovered yet. So how do you know? It just really shows how biodiverse I think the continent actually is. So we're home to half of the world's marsupial species, and koalas is a part of that. But the uniqueness of Australia also means that we've actually been quite successful in bringing things to extinction across all phyla, which is a bit upsetting for lots and lots of people. So when we were colonised in the late 1700s by the British, they decided to stay. Other people had turned up before that, but it was the British that decided Australia was going to be theirs. And they moved in first as a penal colony and then started to bring people over as part of the big migration push out of the UK, and did wonderful things of removing forests and starting agriculture, etc., and really changed the face of the country, right? So that's what people do. We inform and change places, and that certainly happened there. So through that process, it really has led to a great deal of loss, probably numbers that we can't actually put our fingers on what we've lost in the country. So the report tells us that Australia's biodiversity is in decline. That's not unique to this country. And then so these reports happen every 5 years, and what latest report shows is actually the losses are accelerating. So even though we've signed treaties, even though we've got laws, because of the way we manage our land in particular, there's this accelerated loss. And that also means that there's more threatened species. And then there's a scale of how threatened you might be. You might be vulnerable, you might be threatened, you might be endangered, and then it's too late to extinct on that scale. So we're getting more and more of the species on that scale and moving up the scale. So the same drivers apply in our continent as it does anywhere else. Climate change, the loss of habitat, and then the wonderfully invasive species, and how well have we done with our pet cats and the foxes and the rabbits and all those wonderful things that were brought over into the country that have actually decimated quite a few of the native animals that had no idea what they're up against. So that's been a terrible, terrible thing. The other catastrophic thing that happened recently were the Black Summer fires that happened over the 2019-2020 summer. It was so bad that where I work in the University of Sydney, which is downtown Sydney, you could hardly see across the street. The smoke was so terrible. So the fire was so big and it swept across most of eastern Australia, and the estimate of loss for animals, no one ever counts plants. I guess it's a bit hard to count grass and stuff, but the animal estimation was 3 billion animals. That's a lot of animals. So what I think that started, we've been having conversations quite some time about how our legislation and how our governance, if you like, and what we're doing about managing the country and how that might be impacting on our natural environment. Real conversations, heavy conversations have been had about that in the last few years. And within the same report, I love this report, it's been the most honest report I've read for a long time, talked about the EPBC Act. Now that's our National Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, and it came around, I think, 1999 with such great promises about how the Australian federal government would take a big role in ensuring biodiversity and conservation. So it's not effective in delivering improved outcomes for biodiversity, and to see that being written in their own department State of Environment report is, I think, refreshing, because it also led to a significant public review of that legislation, which I'll touch on a bit later. But it reminds me actually, just to, for those people that weren't in the lecture during the week, about climate change, to be mindful of just explaining that Australia, similar to the US and other places, is that we're a federation, and so we've got this national government, and the national government has a constitution, and that came around in 1901. We're actually called the Commonwealth of Australia under our constitution. That's fancy, isn't it, Commonwealth of Australia? And under the constitution, there are powers listed, I think, under clause or section 51. And so the national government, the federal government, or the Commonwealth government, or if you cross, you say Canberra, that government can only do things that are tied to all the powers under section 51. And so under that constitution, under section 51, there's absolutely nothing referring to land use planning or landscape architecture or decisions over land, except for maybe Defence Force, airports and seaports. So for the federal government to be engaged in anything to do with biodiversity, conservation and protection, they actually have to rely on their power to be signatories to international conventions. And so if they've signed something, whether it's the Paris Agreement or the Biodiversity Convention or the World Heritage Convention, if they've signed that, they're obliged to operationalise that. And the way to do that, if you're a government, is to make a law. And that Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act was the outcome of the operationalisation of having that signing treaties. Then we've got the state state governments. And I put territory in there, but the states are actually very powerful. So when it came to signing the Constitution and Australia becoming a federation nation, all the leaders of the sort of states were all around, and there were a bit of negotiation about what the Commonwealth could have and and that's probably really the reason that land use planning and decisions over land really sit with our state governments, right? So all the development, all the planning, strategic planning really sits in the state. And so they are independent from the federal government. The difference is, I guess, is that the states still have to pay taxes, right? So, and they also can raise taxes, but I think that's what the federal government has a lot in its powers too, that they actually allocate money. And then we have the level or sphere, which is local councils. Each dot represents where the local council headquarters is around Australia. As you can see, it represents where we all are, around the coast basically there. A lot of people in Australia think that their council is an independent level of government, and it's not. It's actually a creature of state government. The state government has the Local Government Act, and that's actually what governs what local government does in terms of its structure. The state government has the environmental and planning legislation, and under that legislation they give certain powers to the local government. Now there'll be a test about this in about 10 minutes, so I hope you've written all this down. So about time I showed you a cute photo, right? So, it's cute. They are really cute. They are really, really cute. Why have I chosen to talk about koalas? Well, I think because they're so iconic. You might think of koalas and kangaroos or opera house, whatever it is about Australia, but they're so iconic, so cute. They're not bears, all right? Just telling you now, they're not bears. They're marsupials, they're pout, they're cute. But the other thing is that I think because they're so iconic, if anything goes bad for a koala, everything else is going bad too, right? So they're quite unique in the way they live. They do sleep a lot, but that's because they eat eucalyptus leaves. So often when you're walking around, and you can actually see koalas quite close to some cities, in some towns, or we go out bush, you can see koalas, and often they're in that state as that one down the bottom. That's a deep sleep, right? That's a lot of eucalyptus leaves. Except a lot of people think that's all they do is sit around, and koalas are actually very mobile, and I want you to remember that. And they're actually really, really quick. But if you go to Taronga Zoo and you go pat one, which apparently you can't do anymore, which is good, I guess, is that mostly they're doing that. But in that, remember I told you about the time scale, or the scale really about if you're vulnerable or threatened, well, they're endangered, right? So they're one step away from being extinct. So when we had the Black Summer fires, that summer that we won't forget, was millions of hectares of land, right, was destroyed. And they have particular habitat because they only eat that eucalyptus. They can't go to McDonald's. They can't decide they're going to eat an invasive species. They can only eat a certain species of plant. So when you lose that many hectares of land, the habitat really is destroyed. And because there's already been a loss, maybe our populations in New South Wales, maybe across the East Coast, has already been divided by two. When you lose that habitat and how many koalas actually perished in the fires, it's quite, significant. So without proper protection of the remaining koala habitat, the population will keep declining, and we won't actually get back to the pre-fire population level. So here we are, another map. I'm a planner, I love maps, go on a map, So this is just showing you where koalas live, right? So mostly in nice greeny places because that's where eucalyptus, but they actually go quite far north up into the tropics in Queensland, past places like Cairns, and actually all the way down south and into South Australia. So they're quite diverse climates, but they still need the trees, and there's a number of different subspecies of eucalypts that are very useful for them. They're all fine. The thing is that if you think about where I said everybody lives, right? Everybody's living where the koalas are, right? Because most of us live within 50 kilometres of the coast, and a lot of the forests and things that they're living in are also very close to that. And when you're close to people, there's all sorts of risks associated with that. No surprises so far, right? So cars take out koalas quite often. Dogs, dogs chew on koalas quite a bit. It's terrible loss for dogs. And I learnt recently in Queensland, actually, there's quite a bit of drowning in backyard pools because koalas go and drink water and they fall in and they can't get out. They can swim around a bit, but they can't get out. So there's an education campaign up there about having big bits of rope into your pool so that koalas can pull themselves out. So, sounds good so far. So if we have a look in forecasting about what might happen with climate change, these habitats are going to shrink with time. And again, I'm just going to say, this is exactly where we're all living. So we're going to get smaller forests with the right type of trees for these animals. And then, despite the fact that the bushfire can be terribly adversely impacted on animals, before the big fires, this map was made to actually show that the way we're managing land, we weren't having enough regularity with bushfire. And a number of the trees that the koalas really need the bushfire to regenerate, right? So without a burn, they're not going to flower. And so the First Nations people know about that, and they've been burning many forests for a long time. But it has to be at the right intensity. And the black summer fires just, knocked out, like I said, a lot of hectares before. All right, something cute again. That's really good. And to remind you, it's not a bear. It's hard to know that it's not a bear, like a teddy bear, when you look at a koala like that. But I guess I just want to reflect. It's sort of like a Goldilocks thing in regards to fires and trees. It has to be just right for a koala. Okay. I like using the screen every now and again. It's like, what are we going to do? So what are the consequences? What's the problem? How do I try and work out what the problem is for our friends, the koalas there? But I thought I'd better explain what I mean by stupid. And I couldn't resist but go to the dictionary and just have a look at what stupid meant, because we think we know stupid. There's some great words in there, aren't they? Torpid, I really like that. That's a really good word. Anyway, it's a lot about, lack of interest or ignorance or being unreasonable, all those sort of things which seem so value-laden. But when you reflect on some of the decision-making, you start thinking to yourself, yeah, really, I think these really apply. And for me, I find it exasperating, which is the last word on that slide. So that's why I'm using stupid planning. So I want to take you to a case in Sydney of a place called Fig Tree Hill. And I want to make two things clear when I talk about this case. Even when I sound sarcastic, I want you to remember these things. I'm not having a go at the developer. Right? So developers are very useful in our cities and they provide lots of services, and they operate within the framework, generally, of what the planning regime might be doing. Right? So I'm not having a go at them. And the other thing I'm really trying not to do, and I flag this a lot when I talk, is that sometimes when we talk about conservation, it always seems to be, and protection, that it might be at the cost of something else. So in this case, it's about housing, right? So we are unaffordable Sydney, we have a housing crisis, housing shortage, everything is wrong about housing. My 19-year-old will never leave home. That's a crisis in itself, but it's welcome. But what I'm saying is that things are really changing out there, and I understand that's the same for many, many cities in the US, if not across the whole country. So with this case study, it's not about anti-housing. It's actually about the process of decision making. So here we are. I just realised I didn't have a thing. But where we are is, you see Campbelltown there under M3, so you're sort of just going a little bit north around that M31 sign, and that's where we are. And where Sydney is, under the Y there, or near the Y there, is where the university is. That's very useful for you, isn't it? Anyway, but as you can see from that Google Earth map, Sydney is quite dense, and its residential development sort of is following this east-west line, right? So it's going from the Tasman Sea, which is part of the Pacific, and it goes off out Parramatta and Penrith up into the Blue Mountains, which is actually the World Heritage Area. But this, the extension of Sydney in some regard, is now coming down through the southwest as part of what's called the MacArthur Growth Strategy in Campbelltown. And that MacArthur Growth Plan, I think around that area at the moment they might have about 3,000 people living there. So within the next 15, 20 years they're hoping for it to have like 100,000. So they are working very, very fast to get a lot more towns in that place, a lot more suburbs in there, a lot more houses, a lot more roads and people, right? 100's a lot. So the lot that I want to talk to you about at Fig Tree Hill used to be known as Mount Gilead, and it's made up of 4 lots, 2 separate owners, has a lot of colonial history. One of our big pastoralists, John MacArthur, I think, originally owned some of that land. But it's quite a unique place there because it's actually situated between 2 rivers. It's got Georges River on the east there on your right, and the Nepean River on your left to the west. So the developers released this little diagram to give us a bit of an idea of what the layout will be. So it looks, it's a fairly basic diagram, but they're going to, it's surrounded by, reserves, existing reserves, and they're going to put in some parks and some swings and lots of houses and some other things. I mean, as some of that stuff, as I said, the green stuff is already there. That's worth noting. So they're already selling stuff if you're interested. So you can buy, I have to get out my conversions. So you can buy a lot of land there. What's that going to cost you? About $480,000 US dollars, I think, for some land, etc. But I think what's interesting is when I look at that, I don't think things are looking affordable, right? So, first home buyers are pretty unlikely to be wanting to get a lot of land. The median house price in Sydney is 1.6 million. So this 6-bedroom home, hopefully you can get 3 families in that. That'd be good, if you want to get on. But 1.6 million is the median price. It's not far off the median price of Sydney. And if you remember where it is, it's actually quite a way out of Sydney. So all these families and people who are owning there are going to be car dependent until transport catches up. So the other thing I want to quickly run through is about process. So I mentioned right down the bottom there, just to remind you, that the national law is the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And you'd be thinking to yourself, why would the national body be interested in a residential development, in a local way? Well, that's because when there were initial investigations, they discovered there was a whole suite of threatened species on the land. So that's what brings the national government in to think about this development. The other state law is the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, and that's been around since 1979. And the reason why I think that's important is because there was a growing environmental awareness, and it was the first law in Australia that actually put environment in the title, which was pretty awesome at that time, right? It was a really thin a little document at that time. So now if you printed it out, it'd be so big. But it's that act that tells us how we go about making decision over land. And in this case, the local council is Campbelltown. So we go back in time, that land was identified for future growth, which I mentioned, and because it was identified for future growth, when the owners came to talk to council about rezoning their land, because they had to rezone it because it was non-urban zone, and so you can't build houses on a non-urban zone, so they had to go through a process of changing the zone, which is quite complicated. They came to council, and council went, yes, this fits in strategically with the vision of the Macarthur region. We really support this. So they went forth to work together on it. But I think I might just quickly go and reflect on the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. It's been reviewed a couple of times, but it still retains I think the original objects of the Act, and these three there, A, B and E, give us an idea of what that planning legislation is actually trying to do when we're talking about environmental assets. So the third one, E, and I've added the emphasis on it, is to protect the environment and looking at conservation of threatened and other species. So it's in the objects of the Act, right? Whatever happens under the Act, they have to comply with these objects. So the Act itself gives us all the rules about how we make strategic plans, so whether that's at a regional scale or whether it's a local government scale, and we call those local environmental plans, about how we go about making decisions, about assessments, and then we also, under that Act, we can have things called statutory instruments. It gets more and more complicated every year, this Act, more and more things. But they were state environmental planning policies that were brought out for each critical issue for the communities of New South Wales. So there was one for koalas, for example. There was one for affordable housing, for example. There was one for rail infrastructure. So they were really specific acts, and they have the weight of law, so they're quite significant, and written by lawyers, you can tell. So in the top right-hand corner is a picture of the old zone of over that land, and you can see that it's non-urban. Now, thanks to the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, there was a very convoluted and complex process for the proponent and council to go through to be able to change the zoning from non-urban to an appropriate urban zone. And really what that is a planning proposal. So they have to go off and do all these wonderful investigations of the site, including to see if there's any threatened species, talk to the sometimes the community, etc. And then they go to the state government and say, we think this is a great idea. How about you think about it? And the state government reads everything, and the head of planning goes, yep, we've thought about it, we're going to give you approval to go off and do more investigation and consult with your community about what you're proposing. So that's pretty good. So they've already done a little bit of investigation, done a little bit of talking with people, they've gone to the state government, and then they go off and they do even more investigation about all sorts of things. And I think they had 50 reports to do, and they had to consult with all the relevant state institutions as well. So they've done that. So that process went through, actually. So they had 3 planning proposals over a number of years to change zoning and then lot sizes and zoning again to allow this community. So all the way through these processes, koalas were mentioned. And I think it's worth just trying to work out how they were mentioned. So in the very first planning proposal, there was a technical report, ecology report done. And it said that there was no potential koala habitat on the site. So potential koala habitat was actually defined under one of those state environmental planning instruments, Policy 44, which is about koalas. And the way that they did it is that they had to go out on site and look for a koala, right? And they didn't see one there, look on the ground for scats, right? Because they do. Koalas travel very quickly overnight, they've got a date over there, they're going to take off, or they might be looking for a new tree or water, so off they go. Or that koala feed trees, which are also defined under this instrument, that if there were any, they were less, if they're less than 10% of all the trees on the site, then they can't be counted. So they didn't see any koalas when they went out a couple of times, didn't see any scats, and they did a count of the trees, and there weren't enough feed trees. They didn't think at all in any of that process, or maybe they did because they were very good ecologists. There may have been other indications that this could have been koala country. But the provision under this environmental planning policy was you just either had to see one or count the trees. And so it was concluded that there were no koalas on the site. Or the community wasn't happy with that. They were not happy. So that actually meant that koalas sort of came out of the discussion about what might happen with the development of that site for a little bit. While all this gateway process was going on with the proponents having to speak to all the relevant agencies, the chief scientist and engineer has a panel of people and made the observation that in all this process, none of the government agencies are talking to each other. So the environmental people weren't talking to the planning people, the transport people weren't talking to the fireys, it goes on and on and on. So they said way back in 2016 that we needed a lot more data on koala numbers and actually understand its habitat, right? And maybe actually use a whole of landscape approach, right? And it's a breathtaking thing that someone has to say that in 2016, but did anything happen about that at that time? I bet you know what the answer is. The answer is no. It's my sarcasm. So because the ecology report had identified other threatened species, there were other little wiggly things and some fantastic trees that have survived mass deforestation through the Cumberland Plain. They were listed in the federal piece of legislation. So that brought the feds in, the national people in, to also talk about, if this development could go ahead or not because of these trees. And, we have this crazy biodiversity certification process. I'm sure that happens across the US too, in different places, that really, if you're going to have a big development done in stages, what you do is you just get an approval for everything in the first stage. So you don't have to come back every stage and ask the authority for approval. So the Commonwealth Government gave that biodiversity certification under its Act and said we don't need to think about biodiversity anymore. By the way, you can cut down those threatened species because you can offset them. And that's also what the New South Wales government said, because it had an offset scheme. It said, yep, you can cut them down too. So two governments are saying you can get rid of the trees and offset them because you could put money into another bit of land. So that's the offsetting. But the criticism that, and this really got the community outraged, they were getting crosser and crosser at every blow, is that the developer was able to give council money, which that's good, right? I have no problem with that, to be able to invest in a reserve that was existing. It didn't look for the opportunity of actually doing anything new or different. It was already there. It didn't really need any maintenance or anything. So lots of other things were happening outside the planning process, and a lot of stuff from the community, and they started to move towards some positive things about trying to have a strategy. So Campbelltown Council developed its own koala strategy, and also the state government had a big biodiversity certification for the whole Greater Macarthur region, which meant that everything now didn't have to consider koalas anymore for the entire region, so they mapped it all out. But how they achieved that too was actually think about how to establish a corridor across those two rivers between the Georges and the Nepean, but also working with the developer on this particular case site, trying to see how some koala crossings could be enabled there. Anyway, it was very messy and a bit of a disaster, and lots of people were very unhappy with the whole process. And there was a recognition that actually for our Sydney koalas, this is the tipping point. These koalas down around Campbelltown were the only disease-free koalas in the country because they suffer from chlamydia. This is the only colony that is clear as far as I know. And the locals were particularly very concerned about another 100,000 people coming in, more development coming in, the impact of the late summer fires, and what are we going to do? So there was a parliamentary inquiry with the opposition, the people who weren't in government, got that going, right? So, and it was really a good process, I think. There was, I don't know how many hundreds of submissions and engagement with the community and specialists and things. So what it came up with is that, look, that's cute too, that's not AI, I think it's a real one. Great photo that's taken by someone in our Department of Primary Interest in the Environment, Planning and the Environment, sorry. That New South Wales koalas will be extinct by 2050. That's just the cute photos to offset that bad news. That's what the inquiry came up from. We lost 5,000 locally in those bushfires. We need urgent intervention. We need to stop clearing land, and we need to do other things like establish more reserves for koalas, greater protection of koalas. Great, I thought to myself. And then there was announced the Great Koala National Park. I went, oh wow, where's that going to be? Well, up the mid-coast, which is about 500 kilometres out of Sydney, up there. So nothing to do with the Campbelltown koalas. Okay, all right. So this is great. So from next year, we're going to have the Great Koala National Park. But before we get it, it was Old Forestry Reserve. The government continued with logging in that area because they had an agreement with the forestry industry to keep cutting down the trees. And then everyone went to swear, what? Anyway, we had to change the government and they stopped it. So this is, now you know I can be a bit sarcastic. So if I come back now and take my sarcasm hat off and put my planning hat on, I think to myself, all right, what is it that that maybe we could have done a little bit differently that would fit into, say, current planning practice. So the chief scientist, I'm really liking the chief scientist, really tells us how it is. So the chief scientist and engineer put a report to this parliamentary investigation and said, look, you can't separate koalas between, from people, because it's the people and the people's dogs and everything that's really causing a problem. But in these developments for the Greater Macarthur region and in our case study, there were no restrictions regarding cats or dogs. So everyone can have whatever they want. And now, then it's a whole new conversation about, responsibility over animals, all that sort of stuff. Like if you've got a dog and it's fenced and you're walking on a lead, then the chances of it going hunting for a koala is minimised, right? But that's actually not what happens, because not people are very responsible. But recently in the Land and Environment Court, up in the New Coast where that new national park is going to go, there's this new development going there, mobile homes basically there, and there's going to be a caveat across that restricts future residents having dogs and cats, and that's a measure to try and protect it. The other thing is about exclusion fencing. So our case study, there's now fencing being put in where the koalas actually go. And I can't work out when, on one hand we don't have any koalas, and then on the other hand now we're putting a fence around them. So I haven't worked that out. I'll ring you later and tell you. But no, it's actually through the developers are actually contributing to doing some fencing on reserves that are not national park, for example. But they're porous, these fences, because the topography doesn't let you do a straight fence, so there's gaps in it. And it's also very narrow, so in the chief site, I think at some point it's only 3 metres. So that's not really wide enough in terms of a corridor, so that's quite problematic. Some of the things that might be good is this Cumberland Plan Conservation Plan, which is really trying to map the koala corridor and work with existing landholders to actually do work there. So that's pretty fantastic. And I think it might be a hopeful sign in the current thinking around subdivision and residential development and actually doing something about the koala. So that red line is the whole Cumberland Plain conservation area, and if you remember our site's just north of the Campbelltown word there. So what they're trying to do is map that entire plain and identify what's left to conserve, right? And that's what that purple hatching is. And there is, as I understand it, the intent to not change that from a rural zoning to an urban zoning to allow any future development in those areas, which is, that sounds pretty good. I think there's some landholders that aren't very happy thinking they could have been billionaires if the zoning changed, right? But But also, if you look to your left and you can see, the red border there, along that actually is the Georges River koala corridor. And what they're hoping to do is to be able to take it west and join up all that green and add more green. So we actually have, koalas being able to actually cross from one place to another. So that sleepy guy in the tree because he ate too many, he can travel a long way. Koalas can travel a long way. So you can check it out. So I think that's pretty good. So what's the problem? I'll try and get all my angst out now. So at the Commonwealth level, remember I said it was being reviewed? Well, Gordon Samuels did review it and came up with, 10 key findings about the National Act, but basically said it was just failing. It was failing everything that we're doing. In no way, in any matter, was it actually meeting its objects. And And that's really scary. And when I thought about that a bit later, I actually think, well, two things. The obvious one is that it's actually enabling development over environment, right? But what it dawned on me a bit later, it actually means Australia's not complying with its international obligations. It promised the whole world it would do that and made laws under its constitution to do that. So it's not a shy matter to think that the national government has written this act, and then it's probably been unpicked a little bit in successive governments. But there was general outrage about how that might be. So Gordon Samuels in his recommendation said there had to be a national watchdog like an EPA, but basically that an EPA would be, the consent authority and making sure that that's there. I don't think they looked at the US model, different things. We had EPA at state level, a lot of that's to do with pollution and stuff. And so the government we've got now, it's only been in for, I don't know, maybe a year or two. And when they came in, they went, yes, we're going to have this watchdog, we're going to rewrite our legislation and we'll make it great. And I went, yeah, that's so exciting. Anyway, it seems to me that we're coming into the next election cycle because there was a recent announcement that the national watchdog wouldn't be a watchdog, but it would have oversight on, how legislation is written. So it's not in line with the recommendations of the review, and I think there's doubtful intent. My note said it's just rubbish, but I won't say that out loud. I'll say that out loud. So if we have a look then at the state government, I just want to take you through this quick farce. So I mentioned, SEP, State Environmental Planning Policy 44, was how you worked APA Koalas online. Anyway, that turned out to be a bit of a problem for some of our political parties because it actually had adverse impacts on rural landholders that could not get rid of trees to manage farms, right? And so I thought, right, we need to do something. And at the same time, there was pressure after the bushfires to do everything. So there was a bit of rewriting and a whole bit, and some really nice wording around looking after koalas, and that happened came in 2020, but by November it was withdrawn, and that's because I think the rural landholders found that to be adverse to their interests, and it wasn't very clear. Then, so instead what the state government did, they wrote another two, one year after another, one about looking about rural and another one thinking about non-rural zone. But basically they were the same thing, which said, it said really good, interesting things, but what it allowed people to do was to cut down koala feed trees if it was that the feed trees were in an asset protection zone, which is that zone or buffer between you and a big bushfire. So if you had trees there, you could cut them down, didn't matter if a koala was reliant or not. Anyway, they didn't last long, and then they were consolidated. They were consolidated with all the other state environmental plans that had anything to do with biodiversity and protection. And the problem with that is that they are now deeply embedded. It's very hard to locate any rules and planning guidance in regards to decisions over land and koalas. So in effect, both laws enable development. Nothing in this process brings about a no outcome. Right? It's always a yes outcome, even though there's some negotiations, and sometimes there are positive things that come out through a redesign, but not often. Just conscious of the time. But the other thing that I'm also very aware about, is that we are not taking into consideration the fact that we are being led by decisions that are as old as I am, right? We made decisions in the 60s, great decade. In the 60s, for what was going to happen on that land. We know a lot more, don't we, since then, and we know about the importance of different things. But in no time since then, irrespective of the fact that currently we have a mandate to review our strategic plans every 5 years, not once in that period, as far as I can see, was there ever a conversation about should we actually be growing here, because there are other things at stake. That just hasn't happened. And the other thing that we cannot do is that we actually don't think about the cumulative impact of development. Just because it's all right there, is it all right if it's there and there? Is it all right if it's there? We just don't seem to have that in our thinking. So we don't think, and that's where I think thinking about landscape scale is very useful. So those strategic decisions have lasting impacts. We don't use any of the mechanisms that we have to address those legacy decisions. If it's always going to be development first approach, could we have a development first approach that actually brings in other aspects, really and truly, not just talking about them? What strategies can be taken? We're starting to hear in Australia a lot about nature first, but there's very glossy sort of websites about that, but no one's actually thinking about how it can be implemented. Can we actually buy out stuff? Can we actually go in and get it out using community money so we can actually restore land? And I am more hopeful about the policy shift away from expansion of biosensitive lands, because that's starting to happen now, which I think is really good. Okay, and here's my mate, the fluffy koala. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions if anyone has any.
If we were to implement more national parks there, how would you find the funding for that usually?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Like, how do you spend the community's funds? How do you make that decision? Well, that often falls to the politicians, and I think that's why we got that Great Koala National Park so readily, because one, it was already owned by the government, that was pretty good. Two, it was a controversial place because they were using it, forestry, and they needed to come out of it anyway. And it was only going to cost 50 million. That seems a lot to me, but really it was big. So it is quite difficult to think where do we get the money to buy things out. But I think a buyout is one of a suite of many things that we need to do in a strategic way. Like some things, governments have the power just to acquire things and to be able to, pay restitution at market rate. So if it's market rate at non-urban land, it's cheaper than market rate at something that's already zoned residential, right? So there's opportunities perhaps to actually think about either not changing the zone and keep those lands suspended with what they are, or thinking about increasing things like national park boundaries, and there's a little bit of that going on. But yeah, it's certainly, there's not a bottomless pit of money there that you can draw on and just buy a solution.
It was a great talk. I'm curious about the idea of potential habitat, and if this was farming land or ranching land, and eucalyptus are fast-growing trees, so it potentially could be habitat if it were left alone for a certain period of time, like let's say 5-10 years, maybe. So the legislation doesn't take into consideration, only looks at existing vegetation, not potential vegetation in its, is that correct, in its analysis?
Yes, so it only looks at what's actually there, not what it could be, what it could become.
Are there parts of Sydney that are Sydney metropolitan area that actually are not habitat and that would be better for development? Like, is there space to grow in a more compact fashion, or is the city really pushing its boundaries?
We really like having our own house, our own detached house, and Sydney love it. We have got lots more denser development, you know, so mid-rise, high-rise, we've certainly, you know, become modern that way, but the general push seems to be, or the narrative is about providing the single-family occupancy detached dwelling with, you know, a garden, although there's not many gardens left with the new development. So recently in Sydney, there's been a new policy on transport-orientated design, and we've opened, I'm very excited, I was saying this the other day, very excited, we've got a new metro opened. So the idea of actually doing greater density around these corridors, I mean that's such an old policy, but really trying to tie that in and putting housing targets onto local governments to enable that policy. But the spread is continuing because those lands are being committed, and there isn't an appetite of saying no, we've gone too far.
Because it's got to be like an hour into Sydney if you were actually driving in.
Oh, on Sunday morning without traffic, yeah. It's a long way, and there